picture of Tel Aviv before and after the Iranian bombing. Gee, it's almost as if you don't need to destroy civilian infrastructure to achieve military objectives.
Iran launched over 300 projectiles at Israel, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones. 99% of them were intercepted, meaning 99% of the projectiles that were launched at Israel did not hit Israel. Let's go back to what he said. Pay attention.
Gee, it's almost as if you don't need to destroy civilian infrastructure to achieve military objectives.
You know, it's almost like Israel separates their civilians from their combatants. Yes, you don't necessarily need to destroy civilian infrastructure when you're fighting someone who actually separates themselves from their civilians, which Israel does. I was curious, so I searched Israeli military base, and here's what I got. This is what popped up, okay? I then Googled H group military bases, and here's what popped up. Israeli bases. So yes, it's much easier to target combatants and keep civilians safe when combatants actually separate themselves from civilians, which we know that the organization that's fighting right here in the Gaza Strip does not do that. So yes, when you choose to use civilian infrastructure for war purposes, that civilian infrastructure that's being used for combat purposes is likely going to be damaged or destroyed. This isn't rockets. 99% of them were intercepted.
Bro, tell me that you've lost the plot without telling me. You have incorrectly appraised the very measured and retaliatory response of the Iranian government against Israel in its airstrike on Saturday. And that is completely understandable given the fact that you've done zero investigation at all into the matter, aside from a quick Google search of Hamas military bases, which is a funny point, which I'll return to in just a second. The purpose of Iran's strike against Israel was to establish deterrence supremacy, which is a concept that I'm sure you're not familiar with and you're learning about right now. Let's go into what Iran did. Iran fired a wave of drones into Israel, which according to military intelligence experts, don't worry, I'm not talking about you, were likened to pawns in a chess match. The purpose of those drones was to light up the Israeli radar system. Once Iran was able to plot out Israel's radar systems, it followed up with a strike of cruise missiles. The cruise missiles enacted the Israeli air defense nodes, which are anti-ballistic missile defense systems, which are separate from Israel's radar systems. And Iran was able to hit 5 targets, basically showing Israel that it did not have deterrence supremacy. These cruise missiles penetrated the Israeli airspace into the Negev desert, which is the most heavily fortressed and most well-defended anti-ballistic missile system in the world. That if Iran wanted, Iran could, in fact, knock out Israel's defense systems, what they call Israel's Iron Dome. Now keep in mind, Iran gave a 72-hour advance notice to both the United States and to Israel that it was going to attack, and then another 5-hour notice before the drones arrived on the day of, which meant that Israel and the United States could properly defend against the attack. Also keep in mind that the total cost of Israel defending against Iran's strike was $1 billion. It likewise cost the United States roughly the same amount. On top of all of that, Iran only targeted military installations that were used directly in Israel's attack against the Iranian consulate in Syria. Bro,
I then Googled H group military bases, and here's what popped up. We know that the organization that's fighting right here in the Gaza Strip does not do that.
you Googled Hamas military bases, and when you found out there were none, you thought you cooked. When you did not cook. Once again, no investigation, no right to speak. Listen to me now, okay? In violation of international law and unanimously decried by the entire world community, Israel is occupying the Gaza Strip. You can cope about that as much as you want, but that is the reality. Israel controls the entire Gaza Strip. They control what goes in, they control what goes out, they control every aspect of Palestinian society. Do you honestly believe that the Israeli government would allow for Hamas to build military bases in the Gaza Strip? Be for fucking real 1 second in your life, okay? Don't be a joke, okay? Take things seriously, okay? Try to be a serious person because you're being very deeply unserious right now. Gaza isn't even allowed to have a healthcare system. They're not allowed to have clean water. Half of the population is legally labeled food insecure, and that was before October 7th. before a man-made famine was instituted in the Gaza Strip by the Israeli government. What the fuck is wrong with you? Don't look at me like that. The look that you give when you are unknowledgeable about the subject matter and you are astounded when someone has done the intellectual labor for you.
Iran launched over 300 projectiles.
This is the face that you make when you have no argument, you have zero knowledge of the subject matter of which you are speaking, you did not understand the objectives of the Iranian government and its military strike, and you are astounded by someone who has done the intellectual labor for you. The point of the Iranian strike against Israel was not to wreak untold havoc and destruction upon the Israeli population. If it wanted to do that, it wouldn't have sent a 72-hour advance notice to the United States and Israel that it was going to attack. Iran also wouldn't have just targeted military installations that were directly involved in the Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Syria. The objective was to establish deterrence supremacy in the region, and Iran succeeded. You say that you're curious, but aside from a quick Google search on military bases, you did zero research and zero investigation into this recent strike.
You don't necessarily need to destroy civilian infrastructure when you're fighting someone who actually separates them.
So you're basically saying that if a shooter walks into a school and starts clipping off kindergartners, the U.S. military reserves the right to go and airstrike that school. Can you listen to yourself for 1 second? Can you be real for 1 second in your life? And listen to how fucking crazy you sound. Furthermore, you clearly have zero knowledge of international law, which does not agree with you, by the way. I mean, you're strictly going off vibes alone at this point. No party to an armed conflict can wreak disproportionate violence against a civilian population, even if there is a military objective within civilian infrastructure. At all times, all parties to an armed conflict must obey the principle of distinction. So, again, wrong. And one last point, which is going to absolutely blow your mind, but in accordance with international law, Israel has no right to defend itself in occupied territory. Every country in the world community recognizes that Israel is illegally occupying the Gaza Strip.
Oh, you want to talk about the principle of distinction? Okay. The principle of distinction requires combatants.
Jeffrey, you're going to go ahead and cite international law in your defense of Israel and be so dishonest as to not tell your audience that since 1967, Israel has violated international law in its illegal occupation of the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, and has been unanimously condemned by all relevant international governmental bodies, including the United Nations, including the World Court. In accordance with United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 and United Nations General Assembly Resolution 181, which you can look up, which I'm sure you've never heard of before, which calls on Israel to vacate the occupied territories and stop its illegal blockade of the Gaza Strip. I'm really so glad that I've got you finally looking up definitions and researching international law, but you're still going to need to play some catch up because there's a lot that you're missing. You're going to cite international law to defend Israel and just conveniently forget that in accordance with the Geneva Conventions of 1949 set during the Nuremberg trials post-World War II, that as a belligerent occupier, Israel forfeits all rights to occupied territories and cannot legally retaliate against armed resistance groups who are fighting for their emancipation. You're going to cite international law and conveniently forget that in 2004, the International Court of Justice advisory ruling affirmed that Palestinian people do in fact exist and that their territorial unit is legally recognized as the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. In the face of all of that, you're going to lie to your audience and tell them that Israel has a right to defend itself, even though the entire world unanimously agrees that Israel has no right to defend itself in occupied lands, and that under international law, yes, H group has absolutely every right to resist their own occupation, and they can use any form of violence necessary, even if that violence is symbolic, indiscriminate, for the same reason that no one condemns the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto for using indiscriminate and largely symbolic violence against their Nazi oppressors, whom they knew they stood no chance of defeating, by the way, but yes, still killed innocent civilians and used indiscriminate violence in the same way that slaves rebelled and revolted during slavery and used indiscriminate violence and killed a lot of innocent civilians. We can look famously to the Nat Turner Rebellion. In short, my friend, occupied people have a right to violence. Occupying entities, Israel in this case, has no right to violence and no right to enforce their occupation. Newsflash, Jeffrey, the violence of an oppressive settler colony is qualitatively different than the violence of the people that they are oppressing. I want you to take some time to self-reflect on what I've just said and come back to me when you're ready.
The principle of distinction requires combatants to differentiate themselves from civilians, and it's
Once again, my friend, taken verbatim from international humanitarian law, further takes into account the specificity of certain methods of warfare. It acknowledges that in some situations in armed conflicts, owing to the nature of hostilities, armed combatants cannot distinguish themselves from the civilian population in the required manner. Why is that? Because under international law, occupied people are legally considered prisoners of war and thus meaningfully cannot follow the rules of engagement. And this is understood in the UN and the World Court and the ICJ, etc., etc. In accordance with international humanitarian law, wars of national liberation have been expressly embraced through the adoption of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions of 1949 as a protected and essential right of occupied people everywhere. Here is another UN ruling taken directly from the UN website in which they strongly condemn the constant and deliberate violations of the fundamental rights of the Palestinian people, as well as the expansionist activities of Israel in the Middle East, which constitute an obstacle to the achievement of self-determination and independence by the Palestinian people, and a threat to peace and stability in the region. Here's another article from the same UN ruling, which reaffirmed the legitimacy of the struggle of peoples for independence, territorial integrity, national unity, and liberation from colonial domination, apartheid, and foreign occupation, get this, by all available means, including armed struggle. So, just as I said, the principle of distinction cannot be meaningfully applied to occupied people who are legally considered prisoners of war. I'm still waiting on you to unpack UN Resolution 242, which calls on Israel to vacate the occupied territories, and the literature from the ICRC on the role of belligerent occupation, which Israel is. But like you said, I won't hold my breath.
that's not true. And I'm not saying there aren't going to be situations where H group members get caught off guard and have
Never ask a man his salary, never ask a woman her age, and never ask Jeff Mead why he defends apartheid. Population in the required manner.
I didn't say that's not true. And I'm not saying there aren't going to be situations.
I've challenged you 3 times to defend your Israeli position in a live stream with me. Do you accept? You have chosen not to respond and yet continue to make video responses of me. So I will reiterate for everyone here. Will Jeff Mead join me in a live stream to debate and defend his Israeli position? I'll wait for an answer.
I didn't say that's not true. And I'm not saying there aren't going to be situations where H group members get caught off.
Cope, even TikTok knows I destroyed your talking points. And is it any surprise that 5 days after I've repeatedly challenged you to a live stream debate 4 times now, that you've grown quiet? What's that, bro? I can't hear you so good. You've gotten real quiet over there, real quiet.
The thing is also that tag Jeff Mead gets humbled is also in my own videos here as well. So clearly it's a mistake.
I'm not owned, okay? And to prove how not owned I am, I'm going to show you that me being owned is literally a trend on TikTok, enjoyed by oh so many content creators. It's clearly a mistake.
Clearly it's a mistake. It's a mistake and your AI made a mistake.
A mistake? I'm not owned, you're owned. I don't get humbled at all, okay? The copium in this video is just off the charts. Just to recap, I've challenged Jeff to a live stream debate about 5 times now, and instead of responding to me, answering me yes or no, he decides to stitch another 3-minute video debating me, but yet won't actually debate me on a live stream. He says that I'm unworthy of debating, and yet he spends most of his page stitching me. Right. And he says this in yet another 3-minute video where he is debating me. Call me crazy, but Jeff does sound a little bit scared. And, you know, some people just need a script, you know? They just can't go off of a script.
There's a couple reasons I'm not going to debate him. One, I don't think he's intellectually honest. And he's either very, very ignorant or extremely, extremely dishonest.
Yeah, Jeff, well, that's why debates have moderators, so that both points can be represented. I love that you spent time making a 3-minute long video about how you're not going to debate me in a video where you're debating me.
Israel's not wrong for occupying that area either.
What do you think is Jeff's favorite flavor of crayon? I think it's peach, but that's just a guess.
The Palestinian people have played a major role in where they are currently at today.
Not according to international law, which states the exact opposite, that the Palestinians have played no role in exercising their right to self-determine, and Israel is committing the supreme criminal act of aggression in its unilateral control and domination of all Palestinian life.
Their decision-making is the number one thing that has led them to where they are today.
You want to blame Palestine for its decision-making? Meanwhile, the entire world agrees that the only decision-maker in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank or East Jerusalem is Israel, and urgently calls on Israel to withdraw its armed forces from the occupied territories.
From the jump in 1947, when the partition plan came out, they denied it.
Yes, they didn't accept being violently thrown out of their land.
1948, when Israel declared themselves a state, they and other surrounding Arab nations went to war with Israel and lost.
How dare they resist their ethnic cleansing? You absolute spineless worm.
Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, which Israel won both of those.
Yes, which is a violation of international law. It's a funny thing that you forget to mention that. Have a look at UN Resolution 242 from 1967, which still applies today, which emphasizes the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. P.S. It doesn't matter who started it, which in this case it's still Israel. You cannot acquire territory through war, period.
I want you to think more recently. So we know that Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip in 2005.
Well, again, you're in your feelings and you're doing your vibes-based analysis, but it doesn't comport with international law. Yes, Israel claims it is no longer occupying the Gaza Strip since 2005, but what does international law say? According to many prominent international institutions, organizations, and bodies, including the International Committee of the Red Cross, which administers the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which was framed in the wake of the Holocaust and designed to prevent another Holocaust, as well as the United Nations, the UN General Assembly, European Union, African Union, International Criminal Court, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, as well as international legal experts and other organizations, argue that Israel has occupied Palestinian territories, including Gaza, since 1967. While they acknowledge that Israel no longer had the traditional marker of effective control after the disengagement, a military presence, they hold that with the help of technology, it has maintained the requisite control in other ways. That's because occupation status hinges on exercising effective control. According to the Fourth Hague Convention, by which Israel is bound to, territory is considered occupied when it is actually placed under the authority of the hostile army. The occupation extends only to the territory where such authority has been established and can be exercised. Even though the Israeli occupying force redeployed to the perimeter around the compound wall that enclosed the Gaza Strip, it still exercised effective control. It still was the occupying authority.
With Israel pulling out in 2005, that's working towards what you guys want. Less occupation.
Wait, what was that again?
Occupation.
So you admit that it is an occupation.
Less occupation.
Less occupation. Will you listen to him? I love when Jeff owns himself. This is the world's smartest Zionist argument in defense of Israel's actions in 2005.
Less occupation.
Literally siege warfare. Literally they say it's not an occupation, it's just a siege. Yeah, siege warfare is still a violation of international law, folks. It's still considered the supreme criminal act of aggression. The blockade of the ports or coasts of a state by the armed forces of another state.
Israel's not wrong for occupying that area either.
Not according to international law, which states the exact opposite. Gee, you know, it's almost as if this topic has been researched, studied, investigated, deliberated upon by the world community and all the relevant governmental international bodies there could be. And there's literally a mountain of evidence in the historical record which proves Israel's culpability beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Are you incentivizing Israel to want to give you more land?
If you listen closely, Zionists always tell on themselves.
Israel is 50 times more powerful than H group or any of the groups there. As we can see, which is why most of the Gaza Strip is now occupied by who? When Israel pulled out in 2005, these people could have chose to really start focusing on themselves and building up themselves.
Jeff, how is the food at the kids' table? Is it chicken nuggets today? Still waiting for you to respond to my invite for a live stream debate on the topic of Israel and Palestine. Whenever you're ready.
UN just revised the death toll for women and children in Gaza. it has been cut in half by almost 50%.
That's absolutely wrong. The UN has not revised the death toll and reduced it by 50%. As you can see, the number has not changed. 34,844 people have died. What the UN has said is that the number of women and children who are identifiable, the dead bodies that they have been able to identify positively, is half, meaning that the other 12,000 dead bodies they have not been able to properly identify.
And the pro-Palestinian creators don't want to share this a lot because it's not conducive to the narrative they're trying to push.
This is actually the exact opposite. It is 100% conducive to our quote-unquote narrative. Because Israel has bombed the infrastructure in Gaza so badly, they can't even identify their own dead, let alone give them a proper burial. This is what happens when you force 2.3 million people to flee from one place to the next and bomb those places indiscriminately.
This is very inconvenient to the pro-Pally narrative.
This is actually 100% convenient to the pro-Pally narrative because it proves that Israel is bombing the infrastructure needed to even conduct an investigation on who has died and be able to properly identify them. You, Jeff Mead, are just once again self-reporting to your audience that you don't know how to properly assimilate information into your mind by looking at a graphic like this.
A lot of reason why these people think the way they think, they do little to no research and they believe what they're told. Like I said, if she would have did an ounce of research.
You didn't even do an ounce of research in reading the graphic that you showed on screen, which at the bottom says this does not include more than the 10,000 reported missing or under the rubble. Here's a big news flash for Jeff Mead. Just because a body is unidentified doesn't mean it isn't a dead body.
Again, this is very telling for many other pro-Palestinian supporters. This is how they operate.
No, what's very telling is that you don't know how to properly aggregate information past reading 5 words in a headline, because if you actually read the article, you would know that the UN says it is now relying on the number of deceased women and children whose names and other identifying details have been fully documented. In fact, if you actually properly read the graphic that the UN presented, the amount of dead has not changed. Why can't they properly identify the dead by the tens of thousands? Well, that's because Israel has bombed literally the entire infrastructure in Gaza and blockaded any humanitarian organization that might be able to come in and conduct such research. If you would actually read, God forbid you would actually read, you would learn that Israeli authorities themselves have admitted that the UN has so far not been able to produce independent, comprehensive, and verified casualty figures. That's because in order to identify a body, you need identifying documents, you need blood samples, you need DNA from family relatives. And none of that is possible as Israel bombed every single building in the Gaza Strip, forcing 2.3 million people to continually flee from one area to the next, and then bombing those areas indiscriminately, destroying entire civilian infrastructure. There's literally no way for them to count properly the dead. No pro-Palestinian supporters are shying away from this information. This is all concocted in your vibes-based analysis in your head. You're so brave to answer somebody's comments, but when it comes to answering me, you're silent. Gee, it's almost as if you have no argument and you know it. Thank you once again to Jeff Mead. We can always count on you owning yourself publicly on TikTok.
Israel doesn't attack indiscriminately and actually has morals. Israel warns civilians.
Wow, Jeff, that is big if true. But gee, it's almost as if every major news publication in the world reported literally today that Israel is guilty of just that, failing to protect civilians in the Gaza conflict. Article after article after article after article condemning Israel. Jeff, do you follow the news? Wait, don't answer that. I already know the answer. The U.S. State Department literally just released a report last Friday, 3 days ago, which admitted that Israel likely used U.S.-supplied weapons in the commission of war crimes. What does that mean for you? It means that you are a turd burglar. Bro, do you know how big of a self-own it is when the U.S. State Department doesn't even agree with your propaganda? Even Secretary of State Antony Blinken has gone in front of the camera and admitted that Israel is not protecting civilians in Gaza.
You have to have a clear, credible plan to protect civilians, which we haven't seen. They may go in and have some initial success, but potentially at an incredibly high cost to civilians.
He even urged Israel to get out of Gaza.
If they leave and get out of Gaza, as we believe they need to do, then you're going to have a vacuum.
Let me explain this, because either a lot of these people are not very intelligent or they are disingenuous. Since early in this conflict, right? Netanyahu has said.
Oh no, please tell me that Jeffrey Mead's entire research in proving his claim that Israel protects civilians is not just quoting verbatim the Prime Minister of Israel. Please make it stop.
Netanyahu has said their goal is to destroy H Group's governing and military capabilities and to bring the hostages home.
For those of you just joining us, Jeffrey Mead is quoting Benjamin Netanyahu to refute the claim that Israel is committing war crimes. Jeff Mead right now is literally like, the Austrian painter said that there was no war crimes, okay? There's no war crimes. The mustachioed man said everything is fine. This little dingleberry is not a serious person. Jeff, you are insufferable, my friend. You are painfully dumb.
To read what I said, the UN just revised the death toll for women and children. Then you go on to say they revised that number as if I claim they revised that number.
Ah, but you did claim they revised the number of dead to be lower.
Thousands upon thousands of lives have actually not been lost.
Once again, you are lying. Nice try, Jeff, but you were very clearly trying to misinform your audience by characterizing the amended UN death toll as if it said that only half as many women and children were murdered by the IDF, when I rightly corrected you by pointing out that the new UN numbers reflected the amount of dead women and children's bodies that could positively be identified. Identified. Let's actually take a look at what your analysis of this graph is.
As you can see on May 6th, they had reportedly over 9,500 women who have been unalived and over 14,500 children who have been unalived.
Right. On May 6th, it said reported fatalities.
Then 2 days later, it changes.
On May 8th, it now says 24,686 identified.
We're looking at 4,959 women and 7,797 children.
Yes, Jeff, that's identified. Identified.
Within 2 days, the amount of women and children casualties in this war have effectively been cut in half.
No, that's not what it says. On May 8th, it now says 24,686 identified. And of those 24,686 identified, this was the amount of women that were positively ID'd, and this was the amount of children that were positively ID'd. Missed that one important word, identified, as of 30th of April. Newsflash to Jeff Mead. Just because a murdered child cannot be identified doesn't mean that child is not murdered. I literally read to you the article explaining this in my last video. If you actually read the article, you would know that the UN says it is now relying on the number of deceased women and children whose names and other identifying details have been fully documented. Once again, they haven't been able to identify all of them because they have no infrastructure or organizations which can do that because they've all been bombed by Israel.
If you paid attention here, you'll see that the numbers didn't change that much. 34,735 to 34,844. That is telling us that less women and children have been killed and more men have been killed.
Again, the amount of dead women and children has not changed. The revised numbers simply show the amount of dead women and children which could be identified. You don't know how to read a chart. You tried to make it seem as if the Gazan health ministry was lying.
If H Group will go into Israel on October 7th and do what they did, what makes you think they will have a problem lying to the entire world to further their agenda?
Absolutely abysmal. You are one of the worst people on this app.
And of course, I'm talking about for women and children. Before it got adjusted, they didn't have men or elderly on their period. And this doesn't also include child soldiers because H Group recruits and uses child soldiers.
This mother just said child soldiers. How can anyone take this person seriously? Child soldiers? Have you no soul? Are you really that spineless of a person? Listen to how casual he is about justifying murdering children by the tens of thousands. Child soldiers. That is unreal.
Netanyahu has said their goal is to destroy H Group's governing and military capabilities and to bring the hostages home. So what does that mean?
It means that you are a dingleberry. Wait, Jeff Mead wants to uncritically quote Netanyahu as a source of information? Well, let's quote Netanyahu. So So there is Jeff Mead's favorite source of information, Benjamin Netanyahu, describing the war crime of collective punishment, which has been going on for decades now, well before October 7th. I wonder if Jeff Mead will respond to this video, or will he do what he does every time I invite him to do a live with me and have a discussion about these things. Gee, it's almost as if Israeli officials incriminate themselves and trying to defend them is absolutely ridiculous. Couldn't be Jeff.
Refreshing, you can see it in the top left. 35,000 Palestinians, not 36,000.
That's right, guys. It's only more than 35,233 dead Palestinians. That's obviously less than 36,000, right? It's only 15,000 children, not 16,000. I'm sorry, I mean child soldiers. Is anyone still listening to me? Is anyone still taking me seriously at this point? Clearly, anyone that says that 36,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza by Israel is lying, and that completely invalidates their entire argument. I'm not a serious person. Jeff, you're still online coping about the death toll in Gaza after you've been taking L after L after L for those UN amended numbers, which you completely misinformed your audience on, and then got ratioed on your own response video to me? You have 4,000 comments in your last post responding to me, dragging you. I'm sorry, it's 3,460 plus. How imprecise of me. Remember, because you didn't understand what the word identified means, and then people had to actually spell it out for you? Comment after comment. Jeff, people have lost brain cells just listening to you. Come on, man. Why are you doing this to your audience? Jeff, did you just think that people would forget and you could just keep going on as if nothing happened? Some commenters took the time to spell out the word for you in all kinds of different languages. How thoughtful. How thoughtful of them to copy and paste the Webster's Dictionary definition of the word identify for you. Look at that. That's so sweet. How pathetic of a massive cope is it to be refreshing the death toll count online, making sure that it's not 36,000 yet. It's only 35,233 plus. Our precious, glorious death count, which we're so proud of, which is a moving target because literally more people are dying every day. All the while, it's virtually impossible to know how many people have actually been killed, and no matter what, this is going to be a rough estimate regardless. Keep in mind, this number doesn't even include the roughly 10,000 more buried underneath the rubble, or the million people that are facing famine right now, literally death by starvation.
Nixon ordered Cambodian genocide. Clinton sent cruise missiles to Sudan, people died. Obama gave the orders to do drone strikes. Reagan invaded Nicaragua in '85.